Hey everybody, welcome to Pulpit To Pew. I'm Johnny Gwin.
And I'm Beverly Gibson.
And this is the show that deals with the things that the parishioner heard from the pew.
Mm-hmm. And what I was trying to say from the pulpit.
So Ruth was a Moabite.
From Moab, M-O-A-B.
Which could be, we're from Mobile, Alabama, which almost could be a Mobilite.
Mobilite, that's right. I'm sort of surprised there's not an Alabama town named Moab. We have a Boaz.
We do have a Boaz. I cut your sermon usually somewhere around 3 or 4 minutes in the first section. But this is a little long because you have to really give the origin story of the Book of Ruth. Right.
There's some background on where it came from and where it appears in history and what it means in Jewish tradition. And then, of course, I have to tell the whole story because we've only heard a very abbreviated version of the ending of it. And one cannot assume, of course, that everyone knows the story.
Well, some people may not even know where to find it.
This became apparent to me later in the day.
The Book of Ruth is in the Bible.
It is in the Bible.
In the Old Testament.
Yeah. You know, we talk, you and I, sometimes about our origins, and I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church very happily, a long time ago. And one of the things that we had to do as children was to memorize the books of the Bible.
Oh, in order?
In order.
Wow.
And then, and this was Sunday evening, what we call training union. Then we had to do little drills where we had to find passages in the Bible, and the person who found it first, you know, you got a pat or whatever. So that was just kind of part of my mental groove, you know, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, right? It's right there. And then you've got 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And then you move on.
Now you're just showing off.
Yeah, now I'm just showing off, and I won't go any further. But that immersion, really, as a child, in not only the books of the Bible, but in the stories of the Bible, I have to remember is not shared. And increasingly, it's not shared out there in the culture. In the South, there's more of it probably than other regions, but there are plenty of people who grow up in religious traditions where that's just not part of the way.
Yeah.
And so I try to be mindful of that on a Sunday morning, to assume that people don't know the story and that we can always all benefit from a refresher in what happens in the story.
Well, the readings are, because of time, are relatively short, so they take pieces and parts of the longer books to make, to fit the lesson theme. But if you don't know the context, it changes the meaning of the story when you know the context.
It does.
Hence the origin story of, or you saying what Ruth is to lead up this, because this is the second week we've already started this, and now we're getting the bigger picture. Right. I mean, and Stan Lee just passed away this week. So, and, in the world of, characters.
It didn't take you long to get to Stan Lee.
Well, I needed to, but it goes that origin stories are very important when it comes to characters, because you don't know their inner workings and what makes them so special if you don't know how they become what you know them as.
And that is one of the beautiful things that he was able to do over a very long career, and that was to build a story and then build a backstory and then a backstory to the backstory. And
made them so complicated too.
And rich.
Yeah.
And I think that strikes a chord with us because we know that what is happening in the present moment, although it is totally present, is tied to what has come before, and that everything that we say, think, feel is a product of our whole lives, and not only our whole lives, but the lives of those who shaped us.
Right.
Last Sunday, we celebrated a transferred feast of All Saints with its readings, and so we missed the regular lectionary cycle story that contains the beginning of the Book of Ruth. And today, we heard an abbreviated version of the conclusion of that story. Now, because it would be a great loss to miss this powerful and important biblical story, which appears, by the way, only once in our 3-year lectionary cycle, and because I believe it has something important to offer us in the present moment, let's reflect for a few minutes today on the story of Ruth. Now, the scroll of Ruth is one of 5 scrolls that are read on the different Jewish holidays. This one is traditionally read at the spring celebration of the harvest festival of weeks called Shavuot. It dates, scholars believe, from the Second Temple period, and this is actually important because this was a time of opposition to the intermarriage of Jews and foreign women, especially Moabites. If you want to, if you have the time, if you want to delve into Nehemiah and then Deuteronomy, you will find that that position is supported in the Bible too. But Ruth, however, takes another view. Here is a Moabite woman who is the picture of righteousness, who loyally follows her mother-in-law and who, through her, clings to her God, the God of Israel. And God blesses her and her eventual husband, Boaz, and she becomes the great-grandmother of King David. Rabbinic commentary holds that Ruth demonstrates God's great love for proselytes, and by that word they mean strangers, sojourners, newcomers, what we call catechumens, those who come to the faith from far off. The rabbis taught God has a special love for them. And the message of Ruth is clear and unambiguous. The word is chesed, kindness, loving kindness, loyalty are more important to God than birth or ethnicity or social status. And although it's one of the shortest stories shortest books in the Bible, it's one of the longest stories in its sustained treatment of a single theme and episode. It begins, by the way, with famine. At the very beginning of the story, Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, in the midst of a famine in their native Bethlehem, make their way to Moab where there is food. They cross the Jordan River and the Salt Sea to be there. And once they arrive and settle, the 2 sons marry Moabite women. But then Elimelech dies, and then the 2 sons die. And Naomi is left then with no provision and no protection. Neither do her daughters-in-law have any. Naomi hears that back in her native land there is once again food for the Lord's people, and so she prepared to return. And she told her daughters-in-law that they were free, that they could stay in their own homeland and build lives for themselves. And one of them, the one named Orpah, kisses Naomi goodbye and goes back to her parents. But the other one, Ruth, clung to her, and she spoke those words that we all know, that we hear in lots of different contexts, when she says, "Do not press me to leave you or to return from following you. Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." And so the 2 of them travel to Bethlehem, and they arrive at the beginning of the harvest. And life is not immediately better, and it's not easy. Naomi tells her old friends who greet her on her return that her life has made her bitter. And Ruth, who has come without expectation of reward or of a better life, but only out of love and loyalty for Naomi, once again takes the initiative, and she goes out to glean in the edges of the fields in order to feed them.
Right. I cut this here because this is really about, it is about Ruth, but it's really about Naomi.
It is hugely.
And so you had to put her first because that is, so the mother-in-law is the linchpin of all of this because they end up in Moab, they marry the sons, and the sons die, and then Naomi's husband dies, and then they have to leave where they are. And boy, the whole thing, I keep looking at life was so tough back then.
Right,
just everywhere was tough, famine, and women, again, no protection from a man or a tribe or a family. You were in trouble in the Middle East.
Well, in
biblical times,
and we forget that remains the case in the present day in much of the world.
Right.
Our present reality in the United States right now is very different from much of the rest of the world.
But still tough when you don't have a support group. I mean,
right.
That's even from the point of like, I have friends moving back here from Colorado because they have 2 children, and they need the family support to help raise the kids because they work, and it's just. I mean, I know this isn't like famine and having a hard time with the idea of eating, but it is something to think about when you don't have a support group, a community, a church, something that can help you. Life is really, really difficult.
It is on a daily basis for just regular people. And I was reading recently that for the first time in a very long time in American life, people are not moving as they did.
Oh, they're staying close to home.
They're staying close to home. Yeah. Or they're coming back home and staying. And for many of the reasons that you've just noted. But there is less movement, and there's less an encouragement or an incentive to move. There's, in fact, a disincentive to do it. And in this case, it's also important, going back to Ruth, to know that Elimelech, right, the father, Naomi's husband, becomes important because at the end of the story, it's his inheritance that is redeemed or reclaimed. And it's also important to know that he is the one who took his family to Moab because of harsh conditions at home.
In Bethlehem.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a two-way street, this movement back and forth from country to country. Oh, can I say one more thing?
Sure, of course.
The portion of Ruth that I quoted in the sermon, and we know it, or at least I remember it from the King James Version, entreat me not to leave thee or return from following after thee, for whither thou goest I will go, and so on and so forth. People love that passage. It's very powerful. It's deeply moving. And sometimes people will want to use it at their wedding. But you have to totally divorce it from its context in order for it to work that way. But it does contain that sense of loyalty and steadfastness and the willingness to embrace the life of another person.
A new family, because that's her mother-in-law. That's not even her tribe. That's a whole other group she was connected to because of the sons that are no longer there anymore.
Right.
She happens upon the field of Boaz, who is Naomi's kinsman, the kinsman of Naomi's husband. And he happens to arrive while Ruth is there. Now, the Bible often suggests that chance events are the effect of the divine hand at work. Boaz shows genuine concern for Ruth, for her well-being, for her food and drink, for her honor. And when she expresses gratitude, his reply is the very heart of the story. He says, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that did not know you before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Now, through Naomi's wise direction, and this is where we pick up with the story today, Boaz comes to assume the status of next of kin, and what that means is that he is the one with the right to redeem the inheritance of Naomi's husband, and that includes Ruth herself. And Ruth becomes his wife. And their son Obed, as we heard, becomes the father of Jesse and the grandfather of David. Ruth became one of the matriarchs of Israel. Now, Ruth is an archetypal figure. She is a powerful figure in the shared imagination of our faith, and that is why I think it's important for us to think about her today. She's a symbol of resilience in the face of loss and grief, and she is an image of the threshold between grief and hope, and an emblem of love and loyalty as God's highest expectation and his greatest gift.
I mean, I guess Naomi is the matchmaker. You know, and always mothers and mothers-in-laws always, pushing to make things happen.
Well, and she's the wise woman, right? And she knows literally the lay of the land here.
Because it sounds like you have to know the law.
You do.
Because Boaz gives them a lifeline, meaning, all these things that we don't have access to because we're women, sounds like their kinsman can claim all this for them.
Right.
The Redeemer.
He can.
Yeah.
And if you go back and actually read the story of Ruth, then you realize that he is very astute in the way that he does that, and also meticulous, painstaking, because there is, in fact, one person who is between him and the claim. Mm-hmm. There is one person who has a greater claim on Elimelech's inheritance. And Boaz actually goes to that person and says, I wish to redeem his inheritance, and I wish to marry this young woman. And, of course, this involves land. Mm-hmm. And I understand that you have a greater right than I do, and so I will cede to you if that's what you want to do.
It's negotiating with the other party.
And the other man says, if I did that, that would imperil my own inheritance, and therefore I don't wish to do it. And so he clears the way for Boaz to do that. It's interesting also, if you read the story, that Boaz says to Ruth, I appreciate the fact that you are willing to enter into this arrangement with me, that you have not, he says it specifically, you have not chosen a younger man, whether rich or poor, but you have chosen me. And that acknowledgement of the claims of other people and of other people's desires and their free choice is extraordinary, really, if you think about it.
Some people make a good match. Like, I need this and I need that, even though it might not make physical sense, because sometimes you see, like, wow, that woman's 6'3" and that guy's 5'1", which is close to my life, by the way. But people get along however they get along.
You do. People bring very different gifts into a marriage, into a partnership, and we all have endless examples of that around us. And these two people bring these gifts, and they share a common ground. And that, going back to the first section of the sermon, and we'll pick this up again when we get to the end, is the word hesed, and that is loving kindness and loyalty. And that, of course, is the quality of God. Boaz points that out in the passage that I just read in this last section. And also it's what Ruth and Boaz show to one another. Mm-hmm. And that's a really important, that's in fact the central theme of the whole story.
Well, the other thing too is the two of them together make a stronger kind of team, you know, because they both have something that the other is looking for, companionship, and one, again, love is in there, don't get me wrong, but there's protection and all the other things that go with just the sheer logistics of how life worked back then.
Right. There's this group of women, and we hear them in the passage that was read in church, which is from the very conclusion of the story. There's this group of women, Naomi's friends, who function almost like a Greek chorus, and they greet her when she comes back, and they say, "Oh, Naomi," which means pleasant, and she says, "No, call me Mara because I'm really bitter."
Life's been tough.
Yeah, and they're like, "Oh," and so they come back at the end of the story, right after Ruth and Boaz have married, and after Obed has been born, and Naomi is about to take Obed and become his nurse. And the women come back and they say, "Blessed are you, Naomi. The Lord has looked on you with great favor. And here is Ruth, who is more to you than 7 sons." And they cast this vision forward of what this will mean. And that's really huge, because they in what they say, draw out the enormous implications of what is about to happen. And the narrator of the story comes back at the end and says, this is really the linchpin to David, right, to the king of Israel. And I think I'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, I did write the tree of Jesus, because that was one of the things I looked at, was there's all these genealogical trees of how it all works together. Again, the second part of this sermon, I kind of cut it there because Boaz is the second character, not Ruth, that has to be a part of this to make this lineage and this tree kind of make sense, or there would be no tree.
Right. But Ruth herself, and I think I'll come back to this also at the end of the sermon, is an initiative taker. She does not have to do the things that she does, and that's important. But she understands her connection to Naomi. She feels it very deeply, and so she takes a tremendous step in leaving everything that she knows. And then once they're there, as the second part of the sermon indicates, once again, she takes the initiative and goes out to the field. And by the way, Naomi does not send her directly to Boaz. it is a chance occurrence that she goes to his field.
Puts her in the vicinity, and if sparks happen, sparks happen.
Right, that she goes out of her own accord. She happens to come to his field. She comes back and says to Naomi, it was Boaz, and Naomi then knows the whole picture.
Under the guise of working, right? Because it's harvest time for the
It's
wheat.
working, and she is out there, and this is another practice that we find in Scripture and other places. So much grain is meant to be left on the margins of the field for those without to glean or to gather.
Right.
And so Ruth has gone out to gather up on the edges of what the men are harvesting. And when Boaz sees her and speaks with her, he tells the men to leave extra.
Wow. Okay.
So that there is more than enough
courtship.
for her to gather. Yeah. Well, and compassion.
Compassion, right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The image of Ruth has stirred the imaginations of generations since the time of her story's appearing. And now, thanks to the internet, you can view the holdings of libraries all over the world, including the Library of Congress. And if you look at that, you will see that their holdings surrounding the scrolls of Ruth contains not only rabbinic commentaries on Ruth, but also novelistic accounts of her story, and poems, and prints, and paintings, and stories told throughout the generations and across cultures about her and her image and her story. Perhaps the most famous and the familiarest appropriation of Ruth appears in the work of the young John Keats, and you may have read it at some point in your education, and maybe you haven't totally forgotten it. In writing his Ode to a Nightingale, 2 years before his own untimely death in 1821, the age of 26, sitting in the darkness, Keats heard the sweet and happy song of the nightingale, which contrasted so starkly with his own experience in that present moment, his sorrow and his frustration. He was growing increasingly ill, and he needed money, and he couldn't make any. He was feeling as though he'd been a complete failure in his life. He was separated from and unable to marry the love of his life, Fanny Braun. And when Keats heard the nightingale singing, he imagined that the nightingale had sung through the generations and across many lands, and he wrote, "The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown, perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth when, sick for home, she stood amid the alien corn." What stirred in the heart of Ruth? That's what Keats wanted to know. That's what most of us want to know if we really sit with her story. Keats wondered, and he imagined her homesickness, her fear among strangers in a strange land. She shared his poverty. She shared his loss of security and love. And he imagined that she heard that same song, the song of joy and hope in the darkness. Something else moved in Ruth's heart and propelled her to action, and that was her love for Naomi, for her people and her God. As Boaz tells her, this leads her to redeeming, to new life, and to great promise for the future, and not just for the future of her family, but for a whole people. And then ultimately, as we know, for all people. Among the many gifts contained in the story of Ruth is its assertion of the power of love, to comfort, to heal, and most importantly, to make new. Remember that Ruth's story unfolded in a time of famine, of national and regional uncertainty and transition from the time of the judges toward what would become the time of the kingdom and the finding of a king for Israel, a united Israel. The simple action of self-giving on the part of this woman in the face of a world that feared people like her and distrusted them. On the part of this one woman, that action becomes a key. It becomes something that she could never have known to the whole life of her people. Keats also wrote in a world, by the way, that was transformed and uncertain following the long turmoil of the Napoleonic Wars. And he described what he called the weariness, the fever, and the fret, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despair.
I think maybe 2 episodes ago we talked about how the saint. Oh, actually, it was the last episode.
Yeah,
because it was about All Saints. And we talked about how our connection to saints are through prayer, but also we talked about how their connection to us, like as a role model or an inspiration, because we see these stories and their situation related to us. Thousands of years later, seems like John Keats found some inspiration because he saw himself just like this alone, kind of an alien, a stranger in a strange land, feeling like he's been a failure, but finding some type of redemption and something new in all this kind of like darkness around him.
Yeah. It always amazes me when I think about Ruth's appearance in that poem. And you think, how did that happen? How did that come into his mind?
Emperors and clowns.
Right. And then
Ruth.
All of a sudden we have the sad heart of Ruth. And he paints this picture of her standing alone in the middle of this grain field so long ago. And he imagines that she hears the same song of this bird. And he imagines what was in her heart. And I think, oh, wow, that just amazes me that connection was made. And of course, who knows how that had occurred in his own life, or what he'd heard or what he'd read or what he'd seen or what was going on with him. We don't know any of those things. But that there it is. And that image from Keats has been so powerful for so many other people. If you and I are both prone to follow a rabbit hole around the internet, and look for things. And if you just Google that amid the alien corn, and you start looking, then you realize that there's short stories, there's an opera, there's all sorts of stuff that takes up that phrase and that image and then does something else with it. And it just proliferates over time. And that's one of the ways that constantly awes me, that the Bible continues to resonate and produce things and be creative. And to follow some of those threads is just fascinating to me.
Well, it's a spark in people's lives and creativity. When I heard alien corn, though, I thought of X-Files. That's how the aliens were going to put the virus through all the through the wheat with the bumblebees.
That's a weird kink in the story. But
well, I mean, alien corn. It's also a good name for like a weird band.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
So let me run down some things that we're really getting from the lessons of Ruth.
Okay.
The power of love. Even though things are a certain way, all things can be made new with this power of love.
Yes, you think everything is all done, you think it's over, and yet it's not.
And I have bad times aren't forever.
Right, yeah.
Also, Ruth is self-giving. She gave herself to a husband early on, and then when all that failed, then she gave herself to the mother-in-law and that new life, and then she gives herself to Boaz. So you see this person who is sticking with somebody with the idea of she is looking out for herself, but also with the idea of my job is to look out for you as well.
Right. And there's real risk-taking in that, too. There's a willingness to live with one's own fear. And Keats's image brings that up, too, that imagine how homesick she must have been.
Yeah.
Imagine how strange all this must have been. And yet that's what she chose to do, and she did it bravely.
Yeah.
And most of us have a real fear of that kind of riskiness. As a parent, we're not really excited when we see our children take up some of those risks. And yet, we know that is the way toward real growth. It's the way to blossom as a human being. It's the way of life. And that's another thing that Ruth's story demonstrates.
I know you talked about Keats being inspired by this. There was like a movie in the 60s about Ruth. And
really?
I read the premise, and they make her some like she's a pagan deist, and then it's a love story with Boaz, but then they convert to Christianity at the end.
Christianity?
Yeah, because it's
fast forward to Jesus.
Sorry, not Christian. There's a conversion to God, but she starts out as a pagan,
right?
But of course, that was just Again, someone taking liberty. This movie was not a biblical representation. It was, I'm trying to make a story that makes sense in this idea of transformation.
Yeah. Well, and that actually, there is part of the story here that touches on that, and this is in some of the backstory in the history. Moab, yes, would have been an alien land and not, from the perspective of the Jews, not a land that acknowledged or knew the God of Israel.
Right.
And so part of what Ruth is doing is to, by choosing Naomi and then going to her homeland, Boaz points that out, you've brought yourself under the wings of the God of Israel, and you have chosen him. And that's one of the reasons, of course, that there was real argument about Jewish men marrying women who were from another culture. And Ruth is actually showing that there's power in that.
I know I read this somewhere in preparing for the podcast, but there's the idea of equity, of equality, of a religion that doesn't look at Jewish men and then the alien woman. God loves all of us. It's men and women, and even if you're not of the faith, the love of God is still open to you if you choose it. Right.
And that's why, going back to the very beginning of the sermon, I used the word proselyte.
Right.
And the early rabbis interpreting this story said it demonstrates God's great love for proselytes. God wishes people to come to him, that the chosen people are his chosen people, but he wants them to grow. He wants others to come to them. And that's a really big thing. There wasn't, according to what I've read, a kind of formal conversion process at that point in time. And you notice that the image that Boaz uses, and it's really a beautiful image, is you're now under the wings of the God of Israel. Right? You've come to him, and that's really all you have to do.
And somehow I got that wrong where I wrote. Somehow I missed the idea of like the kind of the patron saint of the person that comes to God, the new convert. Somehow I wrote, she is like a matriarch for the traveler, which kind of works. It kind of works. Yeah. But it is for the stranger who decides to be a part newly to the fold.
Right. It's a sojourner. It's a person who is from far off. And of course, one of the things I'm not saying in the sermon, and I will and say it now, I suppose, one of the subtexts of the whole story, and this speaks directly to some of what we're dealing with in our present moment, is there's a real fear of the foreigner.
Of outsiders.
A real fear of, the I word right now, immigration. But people from other places we're very suspicious of and want to keep them out, and I don't want to get into that debate.
But that's where religion and government gets loggerhead, because there's the heart and then there's the head, because while one thing is there's an open door and it should be that way, there's nothing to when it comes to resources and all this other stuff. I mean, and that's not a conversation. I mean, it's so complex. It is so complex.
And one of the things that I think, if you really begin to get into the nitty-gritty of this story, one of the things it shows us is that is universal.
Right. This ain't nothing new.
Right.
Yeah.
This has always been an issue, and it's always been something that cultures, that nations, that religions had to grapple with, and to realize that even in the Bible, if you go to some books, that issue is dealt with one way, and you go to some books and it's dealt with another way. And they're coming out at different times and different contexts, and we're always trying to make sense of that. But I think one of the things this story says is, don't be afraid of trying to make sense of it, and don't shut yourself into one view or the other, because it's fluid.
And nuanced and really rich. And not a yes-no vote.
So, maybe it can be helpful to people to get down into the depths of the story and realize that there's fruitfulness here in seeing how that played out here, how it plays out in other stories, and to get some hope for our own context out of that.
And because it's an age-old issue, we are still around.
Yeah, we've managed to make it this far.
We do manage to figure it out. It gets to a point where it gets tough, but we do manage to travel and migrate and become and new things are created out of different people. With other people creates other things. And culture to flourish. It's when you do a hybrid of a plant, they make things much different than they were. Sometimes not as great as they were, but sometimes much more stronger, more beautiful and more bountiful. Like, there's a whole thing about a tomato that they did a hybrid of that literally can survive almost anything because they took two strains that would never pollinate, but they managed to put them together, and all of a sudden you've got this amazing tomato that can grow in like even the most harshest condition. So that brings a whole new world of harvest to other people who didn't have that before.
Yeah. Well, and plenty of stories about wheat like that too.
Yes.
And that's one of the ways that there is hope for feeding vast portions of the world where things no longer grow.
There are so many stories of it's the Left Behind series, actually.
Uh-huh.
You know what I'm talking about, the Left Behind series?
I know the Left Behind series.
That was one of the things was the Holy Land. There's a scientist that creates a wheat hybrid that can grow in the desert. And it changes that world to be, now it's not a desert anymore. Now it is this land of plenty. And I was like, but again, all in this kind of steepness of these thousands of years of story that says, by the way, wheat is not a coincidence. There's a reason why we wrote it this way. There's a reason why you said there's no coincidence in the Bible. There's a reason why they ended up in Moab and then ended up in Bethlehem and ended up next to Boaz. There is no coincidence in the Bible. Everything is set in motion.
Right, and when it seems to be coincidence, the Bible is suggesting that is the hand of God.
Yeah. Well, what is them jumping around so much now, but I love this with plays. They call it somebody's gun. So if they show a gun in the first act, it has to be fired in the second act. Oh, it's such a cool little thing. David Lynch is real big about this.
Yeah.
But he will fight you on it.
Yeah, I don't know that one.
Well, so the whole thing is that it's somebody's famous name, Gun. And he wrote, if you display a gun in the first act of a play,
someone has to
to be fired in the second act to deal with it on the third act.
Right. Well, why else would you show it in the first act?
And that's the thing too, like in the Bible, when they make a big deal of something, it's like, oh wait, I probably should realize this and circle it.
This is going to be important later on. Yes.
For thousands of years later, too.
Right, to all of us. Right, yeah.
We remember on this Veterans Day all those men and women who made the ultimate sacrifice in times of war and crisis. And especially on this Veterans Day, we remember the tremendous sacrifices and the great transformation around World War I, which ended 100 years ago today. And we also remember closer in time and closer to home the victims in Pittsburgh and in Thousand Oaks, California, of violence and of natural disaster. And we're saddened to know that through time, all the way back to the story of Ruth, these things unite us as well. And every day we encounter and confront in our own lives the divisiveness and the fear that would try to rule our lives right now. It speaks to us from every screen and every speaker that we turn on. It lives in every encounter and behind every conversation that we have in our daily lives. But Scripture shows us over and over, and the life and teaching of Jesus Christ demonstrates that the only power capable of confronting and overcoming violence and fear is love. How can we, you and me, just individual people with really small lives, make any difference in the face of what we confront? By giving our all, by giving our whole awareness and attention and action. Like the widow Jesus sees, giving everything she has. If we can give the whole of ourselves to God, if we can give our hearts to the transformative power of the love of God in Christ, then by seeking and serving Christ in all people every day, we can make more difference than we can believe or imagine. So I would encourage you this week to read the Book of Ruth. It's not long. It won't take you long to read it. It's short. But savor it. Savor all the parts of it and take it into your heart. And ask yourself, to whom in my life could I show such love? What can I do to help? It will make more difference than you can ever know. Amen.
100 years, since since the signing of the Treaty of Versailles.
Right.
I didn't realize that till you said that, but of course it makes sense. 1918, 2018. Ruth's sacrifice is different than that of a soldier, but the basic nature of it is something because it is giving of themselves for a greater purpose.
It is, and that the phrase that I used in the sermon is the phrase that we use in our prayer for that day, which we later heard in the prayers of the people. And that is, we give thanks for those who in the hour of decision made the ultimate sacrifice. And that is to give up one's life. And there are lots of different ways of doing that. Doing it as a soldier, obviously, is very clear. And that's what we see, right, in times of war. There are other ways of self-giving. There are other ways of giving up one's life. Jesus, of course, has lots to say about that. And he said it in reference to himself, and he also admonished his followers to remember that greater love has no man than to lay down his life for his friends. And there are many ways of laying down one's life. You and I have talked about that countless times. You know, how is it that we give up self? There are lots of different ways to do that. Being a soldier, obviously, is clear. And it seemed rich to me and poignant to me to think about World War I, which was, and you can speak to this, so much more destructive and death-dealing than anyone could have imagined at the outset, and remains, I believe, one of the greatest casualty-producing wars of all time.
It gets overshadowed because of World War II, and so we don't really I didn't study it as much as World War II, and in World War I, it's actually recent history compared to what we're talking about in this podcast a lot.
Right.
But it just gets overshadowed. But we talked about origin stories, right? Well, World War I really never really ended. It just maintained this ember that grew into another world. And because no one dealt with it properly in the way it is. And so that's the whole thing. We are a tapestry of our actions and all those kind of things. And it was brutal to the point of, and I know World War II was awful, but to the point of the civilian deaths and everything else, and the mustard gas, and it, even at what we know, and with our technology and the ability to literally light this world on fire, what they had back then was worse than we've ever used, actually, as in weapons and military.
It was the birth of modern warfare.
And wars don't really have rules, but they really didn't adhere to anything.
No. And if you look at Europe especially, and there was a great impact on the United States as well, that was the decimation of a generation. It really removed so many young men from the face of the planet that it changed cultures just because of that. I mean, it changed them in lots of ways. But
create a lot of Ruths, if you think about it. Think about that.
Really
There's been millions because their lives are upside down and left without any protection. And then, again, tribes move. They have to. When they can't stay somewhere, they have to go somewhere else.
Right. One of the things that is talked about a great deal in Scripture, and the prayer book mentions it quite often, and we don't think about it so much in contemporary moments, is widows and orphans. And something like World War I produced millions of those. Ruth is a story, right, about widows and by implication, of course, orphans as well. And we don't stop to imagine very much, I don't think, how much of that is around us now, too. And it happens through death, but it also happens through addiction and incarceration and daily violence, that there is more of that maybe than we acknowledge. And there's not a war, right, like we're talking about with World War I going on. We're not living through a famine like there was in the time of Ruth. But these things are still all around us, and it helps us maybe to stop and think about that when we think about these stories.
And I like that. The saying you have in here, it's violence and fear, no matter what it is always prevalent in our life.
Right, and trying to rule us.
Right, and so at whatever level it is, violence and fear is just surrounding us. And so the the one thing to overcome it is these lessons from Ruth, the sacrifice, self-giving, and then the idea of love being, because even when you hear like these war stories, you still manage to get these stories where a soldier did something out of character of a warrior and like saved a child or a family. And then you're like, my God, that small act of love that superseded all of this act of fear and violence around him. And that lives as like that glimmer of hope in this world of darkness.
Well, and that loyalty to mission, that putting the mission ahead of oneself, you see over and over and over again in stories about what happens on battlefields and what happens in times of war. And that is it ingrained into a soldier's being, right, is to put the mission first. And that's another connection, really, with the story that we're talking about. We have a consultant with us this week, a pair of consultants actually, who work with different churches. And yesterday in conversation, one of them told me, and I don't know where he came across this piece of information, but it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't seem wrong. He said in polling of Americans in 2017, researchers found that the level of unhappiness was greater than at any other time in the lifetimes of those polled. Now, how reliable that is, I wouldn't say. But I think it's fair to say that many people feel like we're living in very dark times right now.
I read this same thing, and it came from a study of social media.
Okay.
Because or media in general, the black mirrors in front of us, our TV screens, our phones, our iPads. It's that world that you're seeing, and you mentioned this in the end of your sermon there, is like, be careful of what you're letting in with the news and culture and things like that, because it's going to be skewed a certain way, and that's just the way that it is. And we see that all the time, and it starts changing our perception of reality perception stuff.
It does.
And you're seeing other people and judging yourself, and how come my life is not like that? And I can totally understand that. That's what I love about reading and things like that, because it takes you to a simpler time where you have to focus a little bit. And then you're not being, even if you're reading online, you're still getting notifications coming up of probably bad news, like, bombing and so as you're reading this wonderful stuff. That's why I like a book, because the book makes you not have to be distracted with all that. But going back to a foundation of a simple story, of a simple foundation, of a simple tenet we kind of live by, kind of grounds us. And we need to realize that's just as relevant as all these new things we're putting in our brain as well.
Yes, that's true. For me, working with people, one of the things I have to remember is that much of what they bring to me has been shaped by the forces that you just talked about. And so I'm not only hearing them, I'm hearing those other things as well. And sometimes most of the time, I think they're not conscious of that, or they're not able to control that. And then I think we all have to step back, or I have to step back certainly, and say, to what extent am I being shaped and conditioned by those things as well? And as you point out, how can I avail myself of an antidote to that?
Well, balance. I'm not talking listen to one news station and listen to another one. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about shut off some things, and it's that, that quiet, that simple thing. Because my gosh, just today, the things that what we're doing in this room right here, I'm looking at all of this technology around us. Well, sometimes I just got to turn all this off. I just have to. God, I don't know if it's like giving me a brain tumor or something, because I'm scared to death of these things I read about what cell phones give us. But just sometimes part of me wants to go to that pastoral life where I chuck it all and just say, I'm going to go live in a barn somewhere. And I don't know, maybe I'll be a farmer, which I wouldn't last a day and a half. But I love the idea of that. But I think that's striving to see the tornado around us of this technological life. And at least I'm striving to want to be quiet and look for that quiet world. And
that's why, in my own very, very, very small way, at the end of the sermon, encourage, go read the Book of Ruth. And also, by the way, ask yourself, how can I show that kind of love to one person this week? Just bring it down to the really simple place. But one other thing that I've been thinking about and reading about a lot lately is the real importance for all of us of having some access in our lives to the wild, to nature, to just what you're talking about.
The nightingale.
Right. And we don't have to live there all the time, but if it can be close enough that we can go there, I think that's really important for our sanity, our well-being, and our sense of perspective. And that's not to be taken for granted. I think that with our children too, we have to be able to bring them to that, and we have to allow ourselves permission to stop all the busy stuff we're doing all the time that we think is so darn important, and have some time to just be there.
And the last message you gave was, if you take this time to figure out if maybe you don't think you're doing this, and you might come to realize, wow, I am doing parts of this self-giving that I'm giving. But if you do take those small steps, then you are making a difference in the world, for yourself, for others. And we talked about World War II in this conversation, which was worldwide. But the story of Ruth is a story of a single person, with a single family, making a really big difference because of what that's created with the foundation of this tree being built.
Right. And she never knew that.
Yeah. And just making decisions along the way that felt it was right for her, that was things that I need to do. And that's that micro macro thing. You know, I mean, the decisions we make are important. We don't think they are, but they are.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, this has been a really great. That's a Book of Ruth is, you said we only cover this once every 3 years.
Right.
And it's not a book we dive into a lot, but it's so nice. Again, variety, to have something new we read, and it's what I like about you said, it's a long story in a short book.
Yeah.
So you can digest it very fast.
Yes, and then you spin it out, as you and I have been doing during our time together today.
And then again, with the idea of like, oh, that's a connection between this and this and this and this much. Wow, that whole 5,000-page book all makes a lot of sense.
A little piece of the story, a little piece of the puzzle.
Well, everybody, thanks so much for listening. I'm Johnny Gwin.
And I'm Beverly Gibson.
And Beverly, we'll end on your final word.
Amen.
If you'd like to know more about Beverly Gibson and Christ Church Cathedral, please visit christchurchcathedralmobile.org. There you'll find information on the church, Reverend Beverly Gibson's recorded sermons, and sermon notes. If you want to know more about Johnny and his Sabbath doodles, visit pulpittopew.com. I would also like to thank Deep Fried Studios and producer Stacy Wellborn. Without her, this show would not get made. If you have any comments, likes, dislikes, please send information to Stacy at deepfriedstudios.com. Everyone have a great day, and thanks for listening.